Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I've been here for a couple of days, and I've been to this party for about 4 or 5 years, and I always am overjoyed to see my friends, Stuart and Linda Resnick, who have been mainstays here. So thank y'all. It's great to see you. I hadn't seen you in a long time. I love you. I'm also, this is my third event here, and I loved all the other two that I've done, but I've really been looking forward to this one for a really, really long time for a lot of different reasons. We're going to talk about two very tough issues today that people in America have a hard time talking about, and as a consequence, in my opinion, we don't understand as much as we should. Poverty doesn't know color. It crisscrosses race, it crisscrosses class, it crisscrosses geography. When I left the mayor's office, I started a not-for-profit and tried to crisscross the South, trying to understand that issue a lot more. And I had known this gentleman before, but I got to know him a lot better because he really is, in my opinion, the most prophetic voice in America on many, many issues, but on this issue in particular. And I have come to not only love him, but to count on him for a lot of guidance. So I'm thrilled, Reverend, to be with you. Thank you so much for coming. Let me just kind of, do the book read on him, because I want you to know who he is if you've never had an opportunity to listen to him, to listen to one of his sermons, to listen to one of his speeches. It will edify your soul and make you a better person if you just take a minute and do some discernment. But he was born William Barber II. I like that. That's a very royal name. He's a president and senior lecturer of Repairers of the Breach, which builds and supports moral movements for social change, and the co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, which is a national call for a moral revival. He is a bishop with the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries, pastor of Greenleaf Christian Church, and executive board member of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. He also is a professor in the practice of public theology and public policy at Yale Divinity School, where he's the founding director of the Center for Public Theology and Public Policy. Previously, growing up in the South, he was the president of the North Carolina NAACP, and he served on the national NAACP board. And we're here today to talk about a lot of the experiences and lessons that he learned through that work, and he wrote it in this book with his co-editor and writer, Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove. Jonathan, stand up so everybody can see you. The book is entitled White Poverty: How Exposing Myths About Race and Class Can Reconstruct American Democracy. So, Reverend, I want to just get into this with you. This is, as you know, been your life work, and I know that in the civil rights movement, there's a saying that you have to speak truth to power. But in the Bible, it says speak truth with love. It doesn't say don't tell the truth. It says speak the truth, and it says speak it in love. And from my perspective, I think that you epitomize this because you talk hard truths to people. It's a directive to speak the truth, not when somebody asks you to speak the truth. It's like you gotta testify. You gotta be a witness to, and you have to do it in a way that gives people a sense of hope and joy, because I know you know everybody is redeemable. But I wanted to just start off with some really just basic questions so that you can kind of bring everybody up to speed. What is the Poor People's Campaign?
Well, first of all, thank you, Mitch. Thank you for having me, and thank you for this Grand Ideas Conference. I love that concept of ideas. Let me start with Repairers of the Breach, which was formed in 2016 as a training organization for clergy, for organizations, for communities, and how to train them in moral fusion organizing that we learned and were successful with in the Moral Monday movement in North Carolina, one of the most successful state-based movements in the country. That actually turned back extremism and won the worst voter suppression case after Shelby and raised minimum wage and some other things that went on in that state. We learned that this concept of moral fusion, picking it up from the reconstructionists in the 1800s, but expanding it to say moral fusion is doing moral analysis of policy, moral articulation, moral agenda, and moral action. In 2018, we decided that the Poor People's Campaign would be a part of our work. We're working with labor, we work with many communities, we work with clergy nominated, but we would work with another group called the Kairos Center. And the first thing we set out to do is say we cannot have a commemoration. We can't. I'm so sick of those. Every 50 years, every 60 years. The Poor People's Campaign that was originally founded by women, welfare rights women, black and white women, not Dr. King, women. They invited Dr. King in, right? And he was killed, and his wife led the gathering, and of course there was Resurrection City. But we said we needed to revive the Poor People's Campaign, and today we have 40-some coordinating committees led by impacted poor and low-wealth people, religious leaders, and advocates. And we have an agenda called the Third Reconstruction, Ending Poverty in America, that we push. And we say that there are 5 interlocking injustices that America must get a handle on. And because she hasn't, we have today 135 million plus poor and low-wage people in this country, 43% of our adults, over 50% of the children, and that is systemic poverty, systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, denial of health care, the war economy, and the false moral narrative, religious nationalism. And lastly, the main thing about the Poor People's Campaign, it is with poor and impacted people, lifting them to the stage, lifting their stories, lifting their power, speaking the truth in love, but knowing that love always has to speak to power, because power can often be hateful. And so whether you look at it through the prophets or Jesus' first sermon, you have to tell the truth. And the first thing we did, Mitch, was before we did anything, because I don't like to be loud and wrong, is we got some of the best scholars to come together. I said, all the young folks, don't be loud and wrong now. He
didn't say don't be loud, to be clear.
Yeah, don't be loud and wrong. That's right. You be loud, but at least be right. And so we said America understands audits. So I called for an audit of America, auditing America 50 years after the Poor People's Campaign. What is the status of those 5 interlocking injustices? And we'll talk some about what we found.
Well, let me just, before we get on, because there's some basic things that I want to get through. You talk about a third reconstruction. What were the first 2?
Yeah,
why do you think this is a third one?
Well, I think we have to have a third one, and shame on us if we don't, because the first 2 were ended by violence and political trickery. The first one was from 1865 to the 1896, say the landmark Plessy versus Ferguson court case.
What was happening during that time?
It was right after slavery. Black and white people, poor whites in the South particularly, joined together with black people, former slaves and freedmen, and formed coalitions, voting coalitions, public policy coalitions, to rewrite the constitutions and restructure state legislatures all over the country, all over the South. We very seldom talk about that history, right. That black and white coalition. But it was ended by violence, Jim Crowism, murder, killings. A president was selected by the Electoral College and not elected by the people in 1877. Right. And once he got elected, he turned the South back over to the extremists. They were called, by the way, they called themselves the Redeemers.
Yeah, the reason I asked you that is because I don't think many people don't recall remembering this part in history after the Civil War. I believe, you can correct me if I'm wrong, right after that, when the decks got cleared, African Americans were elected to positions of great power in the South. We had a black lieutenant governor. Men. Black men were elected, and the state of Mississippi had it. And then when Andrew Johnson got elected, they did a deal, and all the federal troops got pulled out, gave it back to the folks who propagated the lost cause, and they started terrorizing everybody. And then that ended. That's what you meant by how it ended in violence.
Johnson was part of it, but the guy that got elected in 1877, Rutherford B. Hayes, that was where the big deal was cut.
Got it.
But I want to be clear, it was black and white. It was poor white people, not the greedy planters, but poor and low-wealth white people who recognized they had been bamboozled in the Civil War. There were all kind of laws that kept wealthy planters and slave owners' children out of the war. Mm-hmm. And so when they joined together in these fusion coalitions, they changed. And first thing they did was change Constitution. For instance, in North Carolina, it was a black preacher who was an AME Zion preacher, David Upper Hood, and a white minister from a congregation. They joined together and led an effort of black and whites to rewrite the Constitution. This is what they wrote in the preamble. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all persons, notice that, All persons are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the enjoyment of the fruit of your own labor and the pursuit of happiness. Do you see those nuances in there? This is happening in 1868. This is before the 14th Amendment. These black and white fusionists were doing this. If you fast forward, the second Reconstruction is around 1954, when two things happened. The Brown decision happened, but also people in the agrarian and the domestic culture were finally brought into Social Security. Remember when Social Security was passed in 1935, the Southern extremists said, we might support it, but we're not going to support it if agrarian people, mostly black people and brown people, and domestic people, mostly white women and black women, were allowed to pay in. 1954, that shifts. In 1954, you get the Brown decision, separate but equal is unconstitutional. And then you have people coming back from the war, and you get the second Reconstruction. During that period, you get Medicaid, Medicare, Civil Rights Act of 64, Voting Rights Act 65. At the end of, when Dr. King is murdered, you get the Fair Housing Act. But then you get a reaction called the White Southern Strategy. And Mitch, you and I know a lot about this. And that strategy literally said, we're going to build a revolution from Maryland to Arizona. We're going to turn the South against itself. We're going to engage in intentional, what they call positive polarization. If we get caught, we'll lie about it, but we cannot allow these black and white people to form coalitions together, because as long as they do, they'll elect people at the national level that will try to benefit all people. And they said, if we do this, we'll control the country for the next 60 years.
Can I do a gut check just for a second? How many people have heard about the Southern strategy? How many people believe that it's true that there was a Southern strategy? All right, good. That's a good start.
Mm-hmm. But most of the time, but what happens often, Mitch, we believe it, but when we see things like what's going on with Trump and others, we act like it's an anomaly.
So when people say it's intentional, that's what you mean, because it was a strategy. It
was a intentional public policy strategy. Kevin Phillips later repented of it.
Yeah.
Buchanan was a part of it. He and Howard Dent literally told us a book called A Time of Illusion, where it reports that Howard Dent said to Nixon, now if we do this, it might get away from us. We might create some really crazy leader that just goes too far. And if we do, we'll lie about it. This is what they say. He said, we'll lie about it. No. But if we use this strategy, we can control 170 electoral college votes almost at any time. Yeah. And we can control state government. Yeah. But we have to turn people against each other.
Correct. Lee Atwater actually articulated this the best you can find it. And when he ran the campaign, that's where the Willie Horton ad came from. It was designed to be part of the Southern strategy. All right, well, thank you for that. Let me ask you I want to ask you a couple of basic questions, because I'm laying the groundwork for the meat of what the Reverend wrote in his book. You just kind of ran through the fact that we have 44 million poor people.
35 million.
But nobody uses that number. You're the only person that uses that number. The federal government says you're wrong. And so why do you use that number, and how did you get to that, and why do you think that that's the right number?
Well, nobody used to use it. Now people are being forced to use it.
Better, but before you started talking about it.
Oh, no. Before our campaign, no. They fact-checked. In fact, the first time they did, they fact-checked this, and you're wrong, and people didn't want to hear it, because what we used to hear is there were 30 million poor and low-wealth people. Well, now this is real technical stuff. I grew out of, my degrees in public policy and whatnot, so this is not bumper sticker. So let me share something with you, how we got to that number, and why it is important for public policy and the democracy in this country. The official poverty measurement was developed in 1963, but it used 1955 numbers. So it was already antiquated, right? And basically what it said was that poor people used a third of their family income for food. And it went from there. They did a little adjustment with inflation, but for the most part, we've not changed that official poverty measure. So it basically says, even today, if you make $13,000 a year, you're not poor. Now, later on, the National Academy of Science in 1995, they recommended a new measurement called the supplemental poverty measurement. And it looks at poverty and low wages, family income after taxes, transfers. It looks at what has helped people, earned income tax credits, child tax credit. Where would people be if they did not have this assistance? And in 2017, for instance, by using this measure, the official poverty measure said a family of 4, if they made $24,000 a year, they're not poor. But the supplemental poverty measurement said that poverty was from 19,000 to 39,000, depending on geography and a couple of other realities. When you look at the lens, when we got our economists to do, and the best economists look at what the National Academy of Sciences says, if you're going to talk about poverty, use the supplemental. And then, though, the supplemental also has flaws in it because it does not take into account some of the low wages, and so they added to that. So that's why you hear us say there are 140 before COVID. There are 135 million now, and it's going back up. Poor and or low income, poor and or low income people in this country, and that's true. That means 43% of this country are $500 or less away from economic ruin, and over 51% of our children. And because of that, another study has come out recently that 800 people die a day from poverty, 295,000 people a year, and the majority of the people who are poor in that 135 million, 66 million are white, and mostly white women. Now, 60% of black people are poor and low wealth. That's 26 million people, but 66 million white people are poor and low wealth.
Well, don't take this is my next question. It's my favorite question. I've been waiting for 2 years to ask this question. The title of this book is White Poverty. Okay, so why is a good-looking black man like you writing about white poverty? Why do you care? Why is it important for us to focus in on that? And how does it get you into the main theme of your book about why everybody ought to understand that particular thing?
Well, the first reason, as a moral thinker and scholar, I don't have the luxury of only caring about one group of people. I would lose all credibility to only care about one group of people. Then statistically, if you're going to talk about a subject, you have to know the whole subject. You can't do part of the subject. Thirdly, it's not who I am. You say I'm black because we've been taught to look at people based on skin color. I'm actually white and Tuscarora Indian and black. My family grew up, I come from, my first civil rights battle was when my father fought with the hospital and wanted them to put Negro, Tuscarora, and Caucasian, and they wouldn't do it.
Where were you born?
In Indianapolis, Indiana, 2 days after the March on Washington.
There you go, okay.
And
Indiana.
the reason he wanted to do that, he said, I'm not going to allow a system to define you. Now, am I black? Do I know I'm black? Am I critical on racism? Sure. But that being black and having these other tributaries, having come up in a community of free blacks and whites that worked together even before slavery, makes me even more critical of racism because I know what can happen if we don't have it. But then the fourth thing, I'm a scholar. So when somebody asks me, well, why would a black man write about poverty? I'd say, are you crazy to ask me that question? You've never asked the white folk why they write about black people. And white people have been writing about black people forever. And a lot of it's been wrong, right? At least what we're doing is we're writing generously about white people. We're writing truthfully. And what we're trying to say is that America must deal with all of her poverty because when we isolate it, when we marginalize it, when poverty comes on the screen and we saw a black woman and welfare, we demean and engage in a kind of racist reporting against black people, but we dismiss tens of millions of white people. We marginalize the issue, and it never allows us to deal with it in its fullness, which means it's a constant threat to our democracy in this society.
That's a perfect answer. Thank you so much. Thank you. So one of the things, it's like we practice this. This is the first time we're doing this. This is good. One of the things we found in our work at E Pluribus Unum, which is the not-for-profit that I work with, is that depictions of race and class in the media were a major barrier to bringing people together, to healing. The kind of idea that all poor people are black or brown or on welfare, very prevalent is in TV culture. In your view, how has media portrayed white poverty and what impact does that have on public understanding? And then as you think through that and give us and just talk about the construct of race as something that was just created by our society.
Yeah, we talk about that in the book, Jonathan and I. Race is a construct. Racism, blackness and whiteness are constructs for legal inequality. I mean, that's basically what they are. And you know, if you look at slavery, there were what I call 5 things that undergirded slavery. Evil economics, that the end justifies the means if the means is to make money. 6, sociology, that people can't be around each other, or at least at different levels based on color. Bad biology, that skin color is a deficiency, mental and otherwise. When your politics is all messed up because every decision gets clouded by race. Political pathology is what I call it. But then the last one is heretical ontology, and that is that God created it like this, not that we created it. And so throughout history, race has been used in all kinds of ways. When decisions were being made about healthcare in the turn of the century, last century, it was said, well, there's no need to do this with black people because by race, they are automatically sicker and less immoral and so forth and so on. However, what this does is when people ask me, is it race or class, I say it is. You can't have a discussion in America without having either discussion, and you don't separate the two. You have to hold the two in tension. So I expand race, I don't dismiss it, right? But the other piece of that is, Mitch, when we look at this issue in front of us, and we look at the cost that poverty is costing us, we look at how detrimental it is. You know, we spend $1 billion we don't need to be spending because of child poverty. We spend almost $1 trillion, some studies say, in healthcare that we wouldn't have to spend if we had basic healthcare. You know, if we raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, 52 million Americans, mostly white, but 43% of black people would come out of poverty with one piece of legislation and pump $330 billion into the economy. We are killing ourselves by not recognizing the danger in which poverty is happening. Now, to those that say, what do you have to do to bring people together? You know, I like to go to these places where people are asking what to do to bring people together, but they're not doing anything to bring people together. I don't know but one way. I'm from the country. If you want the cows to come home, you go in the field and call them. If you want the chickens to come home, you feed them. And I'm not comparing people with animals. What I'm saying is you have to go in the midst of people. So our movement, we go to East Kentucky where they say you can't go out there because that's red country. No, it's not. That's Harlan County, where Justice Harlan came from, who was the only judge to dissent in Plessy versus Ferguson. That's Harlan County, where Lyndon Baines Johnson started the war on poverty. That's Harlan County, where you have a whole group of people up there who've been hurt because of the way the mines have been taken over and their union rights have been destroyed, their water rights have been destroyed, and when they have been bamboozled and fooled by these people saying, you don't need to eat, you don't need higher wages, you just need to be against gay people and against abortion and for prayer in the school. There's all of these folk there, and if you can connect them with people from Louisville or folk from Appalachia in West Virginia, in North Carolina and West Virginia to people in the Delta, there is so much connection. And I'm not suggesting you're gonna get everybody, but you know, the Bible teaches sometimes all you need is a remnant of people, a unified group of people that recognize this. Listen, if you don't have enough money to pay your light bill, and your lights go off, we all black in the dark. If your child is hungry and you can't feed that child does not cry white or cry black, they cry pain, they cry hunger. If you can't buy your medicine because you don't have enough money to buy your medicine, or if you work at a place and you can't even go there to get health treatment, if you get cancer, you don't get black cancer or white cancer, you get cancer. If you die, you don't die black or white or brown or Asian, you just dead. And at some point, we have to come to that reality in this culture. And there's a whole group of folk that are out here, that are in the campaign and others that are saying, we want to hold these interlocking injustices in not try to pick one. It's not a silver bullet. And we have a 30-point agenda. But you know, Mitch, poverty is actually abolishable today.
You think we can get rid of poverty? Huh? You think we can get rid of poverty?
I know we can. But in fact, it wouldn't take but about 7 or 8 pieces of legislation.
Can I ask you a question before you get to that and use that answer? Yeah. And because I want to. This question is
poverty and low wealth.
Pointed, poverty and low wealth. Do you think that we have poverty by design?
Well, I tend to answer that question. Whether we do it by design or not is here, and it somehow is built in because we're not addressing it. I mean,
and so you think we can fix it?
Well, I know we can't. I tell you what, if we don't, The democracy can't stand it. You cannot have 135 million people walking around in poverty and low wealth and think at some point that a demagogue or a despot is not going to play people against one another like Hitler did. I mean, you just can't. History teaches us that if you have that level of poverty and brokenness in a society, eventually that society will implode. It cannot stand it, particularly when folk know it doesn't have to happen. Secondly, when they know that the things you're asking for are not radical, like radical left. I get so sick of those terms, left and right. We say, why not let's talk about what's constitutional? What establishes justice? What promotes the general welfare? Why are we left and right? Why can't we talk about what's moral, what's politically just based on the things we have said? Because about 7 or 8 pieces of legislation could just about end poverty and low wages, and most of them, 60 or 70% of the American people want. If you did living wages, which by the way, 49 Republicans and 8 Democrats in 2021 said no. They didn't say no to their own raises, but they said no to raising the minimum wage for poor and low wealth people, and the minimum wage hadn't been raised since 2009. It's $7.25 today and $2.13 for waitresses. The child tax credit, earned income tax credit, health care for all, fully funded public education, taking 10% of our gross military budget and redirecting it to things that would uplift infrastructure, uplift health care, uplift teachers. These are not radical things. They're just right. But for some reason, the greedy oligarchs in collusion with a lot of times so-called moderate politicians believe that things are okay. And the reason they believe it, because they believe that lie about the official poverty measure. I've heard Congress people say, well, if we raise the minimum wage to $15, people make $7.25, they're already making more than, they're already out of poverty. They live in that foolishness. And that's why you have to put a face on it. That's why this Saturday, actually, we're having this mass Poor People's Assembly moral march on Washington, D.C. and to the polls, because the other side of this is, Mitch, we can fix it if poor and low wealth people exercise their power. Right now in this country, there are 87 million poor and low wealth voters. 57 million voted the last election, but 30 million didn't. In every state where the margin of victory was within 3% for president, 5% in Texas, poor and low-wage voters make up to 42% of the electorate. And there's not a place in this country where poor and low-wage people don't make up 30% of the electorate. So why aren't we talking to them in our debates? Why aren't we discussing? The number one reason poor and low-wealth people don't vote, we did a study with Columbia University, is nobody talks to them. They don't see themselves in the ads, they don't see themselves in the debates. And how is it, I say this, how is it that 800 people are dying a day, 250,000 people a year, and that's not a national crisis? If 800 politicians were dying a day, if 800 middle-class folk were dying a day, if 800 wealthy people were dying a day, and somebody said, well, why are they dying? Because they're wealthy. Yeah. If 800 school teachers were dying a day, or professors, if 800 people were dying just because of the color of their skin a day, if 800 people were dying because of the kind of car, if 800 people were dying from vaping, if 800 people were dying from a germ, we would call it an epidemic. But 800 people are dying from poverty. And during COVID, poor people died at a rate 3 to 5 times higher, not because COVID was discriminatory, but because of the way we didn't deliver services. And that didn't matter if you were in a poor county in West Virginia or a poor county in the Delta. And when we look at these realities, why is it that considered an epidemic that we could stop? And I believe that if most Americans knew this was going on and knew how it was affecting black people, white people, everybody, they would be in up arms about it. They would be outraged about it. And that's what the book is trying to do.
Well, thank you for that. I'll make 2 points. Pope Francis, as you know, wrote an encyclical, Laudato Si, about poverty. He said poverty is violence and poverty is death. And I think that you're a witness to that, kind of bears that out.
He's one of my favorites.
Yeah, well, I wanted to ask you about that because I was raised by the Jesuits who, always worked on these issues. But this is a really core part of your faith. And I know Pope Francis has been, a hero of yours. And then what role do you think religion or faith plays in this effort that you're working on now?
Well, I was raised by parents who left middle-class lifestyle and accepted a Macedonian call to come back to the South during the days of segregation and the lack of voting rights, 66, 67. right after the Mall March. So I grew up in a home of scholars and religious folk that you could never say Jesus without saying justice and love. You had to hold the two together. I don't know how to read the Bible without being concerned about public policy, because in the Bible, most of the stuff people talk about, they claim is in the Bible. They talk so much about what God says so little, and so little about what God says so much. But there are 2,000 scriptures in the Bible that talk about the poor, the least of these, women, and those on the margin.
Yeah.
You know, most of this stuff folk want to say the Lord said. He didn't say that, or she didn't say that, or whatever. So it's like you know, we're preaching this strange faith. I was taught by reading the prophets. You know, the prophets say, like Isaiah 10, "Woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their rights and make women and children their prey." Amos says, "Stop lying. Injustice is epidemic. Call for a remnant to go in the street and cry aloud and say, 'Not on my watch, not on my time.'" Jesus started his first sermon. The first sermon almost got him killed because he said, "Listen, to follow me, to be an evangelical, you have to preach good news to the poor." And the word poor there in Greek is patokos. It means those who've been made poor by economic exploitation, headed to the cross. He said every nation is going to be judged by how you treat the least of these: the immigrant, those without water, those without food, those without health care. So there's no way. One of my professors said, whatever your claim of spirituality is, if it does not create in you a quarrel with the world's injustices, then your claim of spirituality from a Christian perspective is suspect. You know, I was one of 13 people that responded to the Pope's encyclical. I don't know if it was invited to the Vatican to respond to the Pope's encyclical right there in at the Vatican. One of 13 people. We had 26 languages in the room. And one of the things I talked about was this connection between race and poverty, because what the Pope says, and I agree with him, is that we've got two forms of evil magic, if you will: trickle-down economics and neoliberalism. One says just give it all to the top and it'll come down. The other says just lift from the middle and everything. And Pope says, that doesn't even work constitutionally, because the Constitution doesn't say establish justice at the top and it'll trickle down. It doesn't say establish justice at the middle and it'll spread. It says the whole purpose of our government is to establish justice, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, ensure domestic tranquility. And in some sense, if we don't do the first three, we're not going to have domestic tranquility. And we certainly not having equal protection under law. We cannot continue. White poverty is screaming and saying, listen, to suggest that the poverty measures are right is not only a lie, but a damn lie. To suggest that poverty is a marginalized issue, it's just black folk and brown folk, is a distortion of the truth. It is a disservice to my white brothers and sisters, but more importantly, it is a form of political trickery that keeps us from addressing what ought to be a central issue in our public policy and political debate. God help us if we don't, but God bless us if we do decide to address this critical issue.
I agree with you, Reverend. If poor and low-wage white workers find poor and low-wage black workers and Hispanic workers, and they find out what their common interests are, and don't let the things that we've allowed to divide us get in the way, the world would be a different place.
Hey, Mitch, can I say one thing before we go to questions? And you don't have to back up. I want your audience here to understand. When I go to Eastern Kentucky, I say the same thing about racism I would say in a black audience. I don't have two messages. And the fact of the matter, that's
And white
welcome.
folks are showing up.
Yeah, because we can have a grown-up conversation. In fact, I did this when we went to Kentucky, and room was packed, middle of the day, and I talked about, we put a plaque, on the board, we put up all of the legislatures in the state legislature, and we said, okay, where do they stand on being against abortion? Check that off. Where do they stand against gay people? Check that off. Where do they stand on voter ID and claiming their voter suppression? Check that off. Now, where do they stand on union rights? Check that off. Where do they stand on health care? Check that off. Where do they stand on living wage? Check that off. Where do they stand on other things that were concerning for that community? And we stepped back, and the guy said, wait a minute, Reverend, do that again. He said, we're being bamboozled. He said, these folk are fooling us. They're telling us they're against gay people and against abortion, but they're also voting against our union rights. They're also voting against our living wages. They also vote. I said, yeah. Now, what are we going to do about that? Because and he was making, his name was McCoy, who was actually one of the McCoys, like the Hatfields and the McCoy.
They still there.
Right, and so.
We hold grudges for a long time, y'all.
That's right. But the point is, I go up to Pam Garrison, tell you some of the book is written based on stories too. Pam Garrison up in West Virginia is a coal miner's daughter. We met each other in West Virginia. Jonathan and I talked to her. We think that my grandfather and one of her relatives were standing together in 1920 in the Blair Mountain Wars when white and black coal miners were fighting against the bosses in West Virginia. And now she, West Virginia, is connected with Callie in Selma, who lost children because Alabama would not expand health care. 350,000 people died in this country of the 1 million plus from COVID. They didn't die from COVID. They died from the lack of health care. And we've got to see this. And part of our movement is to put a face on this. And that's why we wrote the book. Pam, one last one. Pam, I remember crying when I went to Belhaven, North Carolina. The mayor is Republican. He called and said, will you come help me because North Carolina would not expand Medicaid. The way they talked about in the legislature, you would think it was only going to go to black people, when in fact 350,000 to 500,000 people were white. They were going to get Medicaid expansion. And by them denying it, it closed hospitals. And one of the hospitals that closed was in Belhaven. And the Republican mayor said, will you come help me? Some people, black and white, said, don't go down there. He's a Republican. I said, forget that. This man is trying to stop people from dying. The first person that died in that city was a white woman when they closed the hospital named Pam, who died 5 minutes from the hospital that had been opened in a high school parking lot from a heart attack, waiting for an airlift when just 2 months earlier she'd have been able to go to the hospital. It's like saved her life.
That was a lesson of Katrina, too. Katrina came in and went out. It whooped everybody the same, except it found people in different places.
Exactly.
So if it found you and you were poor and you didn't have health insurance or you didn't open up a succession, you never got your house back. If you had all of that stuff, you built a nicer house, you got a Viking stove, and the world was a better place, and you didn't pass. The same thing happened in COVID. Listen, we have to get, I'd like to stay here all day and do this, by the way, but we're on a clock. And I wanted to ask Jonathan, who's one of the co-editors and authors, just to stand up and give us a word so we can recognize him. Reverend Barber, every way he goes, takes his team with him because it's a team effort. So, Jonathan.
Thank you. I'll just say briefly that we've been on this journey a long time. And the gift to me is that Reverend Barber is serious about what he's talking about because he was willing to come to my community. And writing this book was moving for me because it got me to thinking about my grannies. I write about them at the end. Thank you for inviting me to say a word at the end. I got to think about my grannies when I was growing up and what a gift they were to me. They were my great-grandmothers. They lived in the same apartment complex. Now, looking back, I realize it was a HUD housing complex, and my granny's good mac and cheese she made was what we call government cheese. But I was raised among people who were being told by our politicians that all that stuff was, welfare that was stealing from people who were paying taxes. Mm-hmm. So they were telling us lies. They were undercutting the very people who were loving and raising me. And it's a gift to have moral leadership that's willing to come to communities like that and say, we can come together and we can make it different. It's what this country needs, and I'm glad to be part of this book.
Jonathan, thank you for being here. Thanks for your witness. All right, look, we got...
One quick point. I want to get real practical with folk now on the other side. Yes, and for me, a moral issue is not just it feels good, it is good. If you do the moral thing, it's the right thing. It actually has benefits beyond what we can imagine. So let's just talk about voting for a second. Normal narrative, poor white folk vote against their own interests. Data, that's not true. Majority of poor and low-wage white people tend to vote for more progressive politicians when they vote. 30 million didn't vote because they said nobody talks to us. They get turned off because nobody talks to them. In the last election, poor and low-wealth folk, for instance, in Georgia, when they did the analysis, families of $50,000 and below, which qualify for poor and low wage, voted over 50% for the progressive agenda. Progressive candidate. In exit polls say, Celinda Lake, who runs a research firm, says if exit polls hold, of the 1 million poor and low wealth voters that didn't vote in Georgia, if they were to vote, over 700,000 would vote progressive. In Michigan, 10,000 votes was the margin of victory. 1 million poor and low-wealth voters didn't vote. In Wisconsin, 20,000, 1 million voters. In Pennsylvania, 40,000, somewhat near 2 million. In North Carolina, 74,000 was the margin of victory. About 1 million poor and low-wealth voters didn't vote. Do you see what we're doing to ourselves when we don't reach to the totality of this democracy? And what they want to hear is, where do you stand on living wages? Where do you stand on health care? Where do you stand on fully funded education? Where do you stand on women's rights? This is what people really want to hear. What they say is, we're not interested in the color of your hair. We're not interested in how many times you touch somebody, even though we say that's wrong, you ought to go to jail for it. We're not interested in, is your gait slow, is your gait fast? We're not interested in you're Democrat or Republican or liberal or conservative, all that. At the end of the day, if you get power, will it address these fundamental issues of our daily lives? We don't even want to get rich. We just want to live.
Yeah, amen.
Just live.
You guys, this is a great book. In it, we didn't get into all the details because there are 4 myths that the Reverend writes about, and you can read them in here. But we want to give everybody an opportunity. We've got about 9 minutes left for a couple of questions. So the Reverend was kind enough to be available for that. Yes, sir. And then ma'am down here. This is 2, 3.
Reverend Barber,
If we can do.
you said one of the
Questions, no statements.
You said one of the 5 unfinished, I forget how you put it, one of the 5 unfinished projects is the war economy. Could you say more about?
Yeah, the war economy, when we look at we're spending almost $1 trillion on the war economy now. We cut our military budget in half. We still have more money than China, North Korea, Iraq, Iran, and Russia combined. And we're not talking about, and don't even have to talk about keeping the country safe. We're talking about whenever, if you notice, we always have bipartisanship on funding for the war, but we can't get bipartisanship on the health care. Something's backwards about that. You can't get bipartisanship on living wages when you know the minimum wage hadn't been raised since 2009. When some waitresses, because they made $2.13 an hour, were forced to be prostitutes during COVID. Because people would come in and proposition them and say, we know you're not making anything. And some of them couldn't even qualify for certain COVID relief because they didn't make enough base pay. And war economy means the militarization of our communities as well. We have to rethink and recognize that the enemies of a country is not just what lies without, it's also what lies within. And if you are letting 41%, 43% of your people languish within, and they don't have to, and you're not even talking about them, let alone working on the problem, or if you do something and you change 10 million, and you say, woo, as though the 120 million left don't matter, that's not healthy for democracy.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
So I'm curious about, as I look at the DEI landscape and the idea of coalition building, how do we keep with the specificity of the history of the United States and the fact that there were some differences, notable differences, in how people were harmed that contribute to their poverty? How do we keep that reality without being divisive?
You don't back away from it. You tell the whole story. And what you do is, for instance, in the Moral Monday movement, we learned, I'll give you an example. When we fought voter suppression in the Moral Monday movement, the first legal analysis we did of it was race. Straight up race. How is this racism, what they're doing? But then when we went to court, we pushed it deeper. We said, let's look at how it affects women. So we had women plaintiffs. Let's look at it how it affects students. We have student plaintiffs. Let's look at it how it affects low-wage work. So we were able to bring a coalition together without letting go of the race critique that you have to have. In the 14 points of moral organized with repairs of the breach, we argue clearly you cannot dismiss race. You cannot dismiss the particularities about race, and you cannot dismiss how race has been used as a divider. Dr. King said in 1965 at the end of the Selma to Montgomery March, this statement, which I believe, Mitch, is why they had to kill him. I don't think it wasn't I Have a Dream. That wasn't it. It was when in 65 he connected voting rights to economic change. And on that, standing on the steps of the Alabama State House, Dr. King says, that every time there's the possibility of white and black people joining together, segregation comes and offers people Jim Crow a false kind of food to feed their bellies. And then he said, the greatest fear of the racist oligarchy in this country is for the masses of black people and poor white people to come together, form a coalition that fundamentally shifts the economic architecture of the nation. But you are right, you cannot dismiss one. That's why race and class. And where we move in the campaign, we don't ever back off from talking about the racial piece of it. You can't. That's not a true coalition. That's not a moral coalition. You can't release those realities. That's why we say it's 5 interlocking injustices: systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation / the denial of health care, the war economy, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism, which we don't have time to deal with, but God knows I wish we could.
Well, yeah, me too, but I'm not going to take that bait. Yes, ma'am. Because
Hi, Reverend Barber.
Yes,
I
ma'am.
actually had the honor of marching with you in Raleigh in 2018, and I'm just so pleased to be here and get to hear you speak again. Now I work organizing tenants in Colorado, and we sit in front of the mayor, city councilors, local state representatives who tell us, your tenants' problems are real, and we hear them, and there's nothing we can do. That's at the federal level. And then when we talk to federal representatives and senators, it's start at the local level, and it feels like we're getting kicked back and forth. Where do you suggest?
there we go. Thank you.
You are
dig
getting
in.
kicked back and forth. And that's why we have to have a movement. You said you marched with me in 2018. We had a movement, and we had policy directives, and we had lawsuits. Let me tell you, in a democracy, if you want fundamental change, you will not get around having to have the agitation of protests, legislation, litigation, and voter participation. And all 4 must be engaged. All 4 must be engaged. That's why we're going to DC, but we're not going to DC for a picnic or a fellowship. We're going to DC to put a face on this issue, but as a part of what we're doing, we're committing to reach 15 million poor and low-wage voters between now and November. Repairs of the Breach that I run is coordinating that. You say 15 million, yeah, if you get 200 people in 35 states plus the District of Columbia, those 200 people will use the best technology, reach 45 people a day, 6 days a week for 8 weeks. They reach over 15 million people. We're going after them. We're doing it in a nonpartisan way, but we're putting information because poor people have to now use this power. If you want change, we can't say, well, they didn't talk to us, sit home. No, in a democracy, you must agitate both sometimes in the street and in the suites, but you got to do it at the polls. You must make people hear you, make them hear you. And the narrative is poor people don't vote, which is not true, but what they do is they vote less percentage than middle class and high. We have to change that, and it's not even a big lift. There's not a state in this country where 25% of poor and low-wage people who have not voted were to vote, that they would not have a fundamental impact on at-large elections, federal election, and state election. We've got to build an offense.
Amen. Last question of the night is going to be by our professor. Professor,
Oh my.
we're going to land this on time. Land this.
No,
Go ahead.
this will be an easy one
Yeah, right.
because, as you well know, Reverend, we overwhelmingly incarcerate the poor.
Mm-hmm.
They are the people, the 1.9 million people who are behind bars. And so I wanted to invite you to speak directly to them because they cannot vote, they cannot march, and yet you and I both know that they are desperate to see a better world, not just for themselves, but for their families and their communities. And
Well,
so
well, you know, my faith says then I have to, if they can't, I must for them. That's part of it. That my faith says that I must care about the imprisoned. From Jesus' first words that almost got him killed to his last words that got him crucified to his own, I follow a convicted felon who was wrongfully convicted. And so I have to. But secondly, that means we have to fight hard on the outside for felony reenfranchisement. So that when people, and we've done that in North Carolina, even though once we did it, we had the largest coming back to voting rights, and then the state legislature, tried to take it away, and now we're in court. But we have to keep the battle. We have to keep the battle. And then lastly, I've been to jail. I've been arrested 17 times, I think. Yeah, something like that. I don't know what it was. But when I go to jail, I organize. And this is what I know. Don't ever underestimate the power of people to organize from behind the cell block. And I say to the brothers, look, if you can run something else from behind the cell block, then why don't you run telling your communities and voting? We've just got to have some candidates, and it's going to have to come also from the poor, who will talk directly to people. And we can't have what some Republicans do, where they say the poor are their own morals, it's their own moral failing. And we can't have Democrats that say those trying to make it into the middle class. Poor people want the word to be said. People ask us, why do we name it the Poor People's Campaign? Because they said name it that way. It's not, we didn't do it. The poor people said they're not ashamed of being poor. They're ashamed of a damn country that won't address it. That's what the shame is, and won't talk about them, and can have 15 presidential debates, and what's happening to 135 million people doesn't even come up 10 minutes. That's what they're ashamed of. And that's why we have to have an audience, a movement that can shift that. But my brothers and sisters who are incarcerated, let me just say this to us. May I preach just 1 minute, and I'm through because it's 0-0. In the book of, whether you read it as faith or whether you just want to read it as literature, go sometime and read in the book of Judges. In the book of Judges, the nation was in trouble, bad trouble. And they had put a guy out because his mama was a prostitute, his daddy had a fling, and they threw him out of the community and said he was no good. His name was Jephthah. Then an enemy began to attack the country. And the elders said, the only one who can save us is Jephthah. But they had thrown Jephthah in the land of Tob, among the incarcerated, among those. And they had to go to the very people they threw away to ask them to save the country. What if some of the people we have thrown away, who should have gotten drug treatment and not incarceration, are the hope of this society?
Amen. All right. We're going to end it on that. Reverend, thank you so much for coming.